Mr. Clark's back. It's time to take a look at 18.6, the Gerald R. Ford presidency. We're going to see how he took over for President Nixon and some of the struggles he had as president. What you really need to do is to make sure you have your Google document opened up with the focus questions. As I go through the lesson, you can fill out your responses on the focus question document. When you conclude going through the lesson, you'll submit your responses in Google Classroom and you'll receive credit for filling them out correctly. Obviously, since you are receiving the answers, I will expect that you have all the correct answers down. A good idea too, like for example, in my house, we're able to stream YouTube on one of our TVs in our house. So, if you do have the opportunity to stream the YouTube version of this on a bigger screen and you can have your Chromebook opened up to fill out the answers as you go through it, that might be easier for you. The wording and everything like that will be larger too if you have it on a larger screen. Some of the objectives that we'll cover through 18.6, part 1, will be obviously the presidency of Ford, his domestic and foreign policies, and eventually the challenge that Jimmy Carter would present to President Ford. I have a link there for Ford's biography. It's maybe about 4 or 5 minutes. If you do want to take a look at that, that might be a good way for you to get a visual image of Ford, his presidency, and hear about some of the same stuff that I'll be discussing here with question 1, kind of his background. Ford, he was a well-educated individual going to one of the more prestigious colleges in the country, Yale University, obtained a law degree from Yale. During his undergrad work, he was a college football star in Michigan, which is also where he served in the House of Representatives for almost 25 years. And during that period of time that he was in the House of Representatives, he was the House leader for Republicans for about 8 years. House leader means that whether the Republican Party controlled the Congress, then he would be the Speaker of the House. House Republican leader, he's kind of like the minority leader, meaning the top-ranking Republican. Republicans really did not control the House very often during the late 60s into the 1970s. Also, too, he was a decorated naval veteran serving in the Navy during World War II. Ford, of course, became vice president during unusual circumstances. Richard Nixon, of course, had a troubled presidency, and during his presidency, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, was forced to resign on a separate incident unrelated to Watergate. Spiro Agnew had taken bribes when he was the governor of Maryland. He had to step down. So before even Nixon resigned the presidency, his vice president resigned, and that allowed for Nixon to choose his own vice president, who he chose, which was Ford. So President Ford is the only person to have ever served as president of the United States who did not serve first in an elected position as vice president or obviously elected as president. So he was the only person to be appointed to a position and then ascend to the presidency. So amongst the challenges, of course, that Ford's going to face as he was sworn in as president, the country was kind of like shaken by the whole scandal surrounding Watergate. You could kind of envision what was going on in the country during Watergate based on what you went through as President Trump was going through his own impeachment inquiry and eventually the trial to see if he was going to be removed as president. Richard Nixon, he was like one step behind where President Trump ended up. They had drafted articles of impeachment. They had not yet voted on them in the House of Representatives. Most estimates from a historical standpoint is that Nixon would have been impeached and removed from the presidency. That's why he stepped down. So as Ford comes into the presidency in 1974, he had to go through a lot in terms of reuniting the country together. And one thing he wanted to do was to kind of take a step back from the Watergate scandal. So rather than allow for President Nixon to go on trial for some of the crimes he may have committed, he instead issued a full pardon on September 8th, 1974, stating, "I grant a full, free, and absolute pardon to Richard Nixon for any crimes he committed or may have taken part with as President of the United States." So, of course, this was in an attempt to avoid what would be a media circus. As you know, even in the Trump impeachment inquiry was the entire news media that was covering Trump being impeached and the whole trial on a nightly basis, nonstop. And that's pretty much what would have happened even in the aftermath of Nixon's presidency had he gone on trial for actual crimes and maybe been convicted and put in prison. So the image of an American president in prison is not something that most Americans wanted to see either. Others who were a little bit more skeptical, especially Democrats, they kind of looked at it. Maybe there was a corrupt bargain behind the scenes. Maybe Nixon knew in the back of his mind he had committed these crimes and that he needed somebody to kind of prevent him from going to prison. So maybe he made a deal with Ford saying, "Hey, I'll give you the vice presidency and I'll step down from the presidency at some point in time in the next year or so. You could become president. And when you become president, you can give me a full pardon." So that's kind of the corrupt aspect there as you look at number 3. This further increased the distrust that Americans had in their government and the office of the presidency. Many people believe that Nixon had abused his power as president and therefore should be fully prosecuted. I'm looking at question 4. As Ford granted the pardon, I kind of alluded to that in my description. And as I go through these questions, I'm not going to always read them word for word. I'll kind of try and tell you the story. And while I'm telling you the story, you can be looking at the questions and kind of understanding the different discussions I'm having here. And you can kind of get down what you need to for each of the responses. So when you think about question 5, the impact of Ford pardoning President Nixon, well, it did not really play out very well for President Ford. When he had first become president during the early months of his presidency, he had a pretty strong approval rating of 71%. And if you think the American public is generally divided roughly 30% Democrats, 30% Republicans, and then there's maybe about 35 or 40% in there who support other political parties or independents. So when you look at 71%, anytime a president is well over 50% in terms of their approval rating, that means they have broad support beyond their own political party. And that was the case of Ford initially during his early part of his presidency. When you look at the pardon, after the pardon, his approval rating went down to around 50%. So just when you look at President Trump, his approval rating tends to be currently somewhere in the 42 to 45% range. There's been points in time, obviously not in the middle of the pandemic or during an economic crisis, where his approval rating has been around 50%, 49%, somewhere in that area. But for the most part, his approval rating throughout his presidency has been somewhere in the low to mid 40s, meaning the majority of the country, which of course the majority of the country did vote against him in 2016, kind of remain in a disapproval of his presidency. Okay, when you look at question number 6, what economic problems did President Ford face in 1975? He was hit up with one of the worst recessions that the country had had since the Great Depression. One of the contributing factors to the poor economy during the middle 1970s was inflation. Inflation, of course, is when the price of goods goes up, while at the same point in time, you're dealing with a lot of issues where your salary remains kind of flat. During this period of time, we saw a lot of factories close, a lot of people were losing their jobs as unemployment began to spiral out of control. And for the first time, we're dealing with extensive issues with energy. We have more and more automobiles on the roads throughout the United States and around the world as the population continues to increase around the world. Obviously, that's putting a greater strain on oil and oil prices. So as any president, they try to come up with ideas to take on issues and solve problems for the country. So President Ford came up with an idea. He nicknamed it his WIN plan. And WIN, in the case of Ford's plan to improve the American economy, as you can see a little visual there, it stands for Whip Inflation Now, WIN or WIN. So his WIN plan included mandatory wage and price controls in an attempt to reduce the inflationary rate in the country. He also encouraged Americans to conserve a little bit, to cut back on oil and gas consumption. This would mean, too, maybe carpooling to work or driving a little bit less, keeping your thermostat in your house a little bit lower so that you're not using as much fuel to heat your home. Unfortunately, this plan, the win plan, was a kind of a loser for Ford, not necessarily a win in terms of the economy or the support for his presidency. Next, we'll take a look at some of Ford's foreign policy issues. By the mid-1970s, the United States was beginning to, and Americans were beginning to question some foreign policy goals by the mid-70s. Obviously, we had just come out of the Vietnam War. It was not that long previous that we had gotten out of the war. We're only maybe about 2 years removed from Vietnam. So one of the things that we were doing is we were supporting any country, for the most part, that was anti-communist. So in some ways, we would support a brutal dictator or a tyrant in office as long as they were anti-communist or they were opposed to communism. So some Americans were kind of questioning whether or not we should support dictators who were in power just because they were not communists, whether or not that was the best idea or not. In addition to that, some people wondered, was détente, was the idea that Nixon and Kissinger, when they came into the presidency in 1969, they had implemented the idea we should try and thaw out the Cold War and lessen the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union and China. Many speculated whether the United States should put more of an emphasis on protecting human rights around the world. Should the United States kind of be the big brother for countries around the world? If we see a country that's impoverished or struggling, is it the responsibility of the United States to kind of step in those cases? And that's something you have to really consider as an individual as well, because obviously you'll be voting soon enough. If not in this upcoming election in 2016, because most of you will not be 18 at that point in time, but certainly for the next governor's race in New Jersey in 2021. So maybe not 18 for the 2020 presidential election, but you may be 18 by the 2021 election for governor in New Jersey, as Governor Murphy, I assume, will be running for re-election against a unnamed at this point in time or chosen Republican challenger. So we look at President Ford's goals in regard to foreign policy. One thing he did that was kind of a wise decision, because he was still very well respected by both Democrats and Republicans, he kept on Henry Kissinger as his Secretary of State. Kissinger, of course, one of the authors of the détente policy. He tried to get Ford to carry out those policies with China and the Soviet Union. Ford wanted to resupply the South Vietnamese, who were still at this point in time, early in the Ford presidency, struggling to try and defeat Ho Chi Minh and the communists in North Vietnam. But Congress rejected the idea of American support for the South Vietnamese, and as a result, South Vietnam is going to ultimately lose the war to North Vietnam. 10. How did the Helsinki Accords impact the Cold War? Well, the United States and NATO nations agreed to recognize the borders of Eastern Europe. These were the Soviet bloc countries or satellite states of the Soviet Union. For a long period of time, we kind of ignored the idea and tried to not really engage too much in regard to these communist Eastern European countries. So we did recognize those which were, carved up by the Soviet Union. In return, the Soviet Union's promise was to kind of uphold human rights in the countries that they were dominating or controlling. Did Gerald Ford stand behind his endorsement of the Helsinki Accords? Well, Ford was struggling to ensure that the safety of the planet. He wanted to prevent nuclear war at all costs. Ford put arms control in some ways ahead of human rights, which went against the Helsinki Accords. So he was kind of prioritizing, a nuclear disarmament, or at least a somewhat of a cutback, if possible, with the Soviet Union as our chief adversary during the Cold War. And he kind of prioritized those Cold War policies at the expense of the human rights of many of the Soviet bloc countries. One area where the United States did not intervene in terms of a tragic event ongoing around the world was in Cambodia, in the Khmer Rouge genocide. The United States knew about it and really stood by and did not do much at all. The Communist Party, also known as the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, their leader, Pol Pot, He had taken control right around the time the Vietnam War was coming to an end in 1975. His Cambodian genocide was carried out by Pol Pot and his supporters. And in a period of time between 1975 and 1979, somewhere around 1.5 to as many as 3 million people died in a genocidal act in Cambodia. Now, after the disaster of the Vietnam War, the United States was hesitant to get involved in Southeast Asia again. And so we did nothing to really stop the ongoing killing. They were nicknamed the killing fields in Cambodia. Here's a quote from Pol Pot. Kind of sums up his brutal philosophy. Better to kill an innocent by mistake than to spare an enemy by mistake. He who opposes Pol Pot is a corpse. So basically, if you opposed him, you would die. The little red book of Pol Pot, red book symbolizing communism. One of the more embarrassing events in terms of the Ford administration involved an American cargo ship. The Mayaguez was seized by Cambodia and was traveling along its shores. President Ford sent in the Marines to rescue the crew and the ship. And the American forces were deployed, even though the Cambodians had released the crew before the Marines arrived. So it kind of made Ford look ill-informed as he was deploying American troops in an event that was already handled. 14, as the Vietnam War came to an end in 1975, had an impact the citizens of Vietnam. As the communists took control of a united Vietnam, all of which was communist, thousands of refugees from Vietnam fled, and over a 20-year period of time, over 1 million, as they nicknamed them, boat people or Vietnamese refugees fled, many on makeshift boats. You can see one that's kind of a raft on the left side there in black and white. On the right is a refugee ship that looks like it's about ready to capsize there and sink. So a lot of people lost their lives in an attempt to flee Vietnam. So not only was it a disaster during the war itself for about a decade period of time, we had a series of tragic events even in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. So as Ford's presidency is seeing one struggle, one challenge after the other, we would have an election in 1976. For the Republicans, they nominated Gerald Ford for the presidency. His vice presidential running mate was Bob Dole. So if you look on the far right photograph there, you see Ford in the center here. This is Bob Dole. He was a longtime senator, a Republican, one of the leaders in the Republican Party. He would run for the presidency on his own in 1996. Actually, the four candidates here for president and vice president, respectively, all four of them would run for the presidency. And in fact, all four of these candidates at one point in time would lose a run for the presidency. The only winner is going to be Jimmy Carter this one time here in 1976. Pictured centered here, Jimmy Carter on the left, Walter Mondale on the right. Mondale was the vice presidential running mate with Jimmy Carter. Carter's from Georgia. Mondale's from Minnesota. And one of the more popular TV shows during this period of time in history was the show Happy Days, and the lead character in Happy Days was Fonzie. So you could see there's a campaign button for the 1976 election with Gerald Ford kind of dressed up as Fonzie. Fonzie always wore a black leather jacket and a white T-shirt. That's the same outfit that Ford has on. You could see there with Ford with his win button on there, his Whip Inflation Now campaign button. It was a very close election, roughly 2% of the vote difference, and an electoral vote count that was very, very narrow. When you see 297 and 240, it kind of looks like it's, a comfortable victory for Jimmy Carter. But in reality, if any one state or more than one state totaling just 30 electoral votes had switched from Carter to Ford, Ford would have been elected president in 1976. Many states have more than 30 electoral votes. States like Texas, California, New York State, even Florida, pretty close to 30 electoral votes today. So you have a lot of different states that kind of carry that weight. And so just even a short shift, a small shift in the popular vote in a state or two could have delivered the presidency to Ford. So the challenger to Ford, and there's a little bio link there that I would encourage you to take a look at on Jimmy Carter, get a little more background on him. So you look at Carter, he grew up in a small town in Plains, Georgia. He had a very interesting career prior to getting into politics. He was a peanut farmer. You may think he's nuts, but he did make a good living off of that, owning a tremendous amount of land, and was a very successful plantation owner. Of course, plantations in the 1960s and 70s were by paid laborers. We kind of associate plantations in a negative connotation based on our studies previously during the period of time of slavery, but the large-scale commercial farming still exists throughout much of the country. He served as the governor of Georgia, which was his political experience. He, too, was a naval veteran. He campaigned in 1976 as a Washington outsider, meaning that he was not tied to all the corruption in Washington, D.C., especially during the 1970s. Not having been in Washington, D.C. very much is actually a net positive in the 1970s in the aftermath of the Nixon scandal and Watergate. And he was very religious, a born-again Christian. What were the advantages of Carter being an outsider? What were the disadvantages? So as a Washington outsider, people could identify with him. They kind of seemed like somebody that they can, hang out with, or they might see walking around their town. And a lot of times, too, when Jimmy Carter would campaign, instead of wearing a, $1,000 suit, he would wear, a flannel shirt, dress very casually, not like an elite politician. He didn't look kind of like slick. A lot of times you see a politician look kind of like, they're trying to sell you something in some ways. His lack of experience would be a negative. This would allow for him to struggle initially when he becomes president to pass bills and implement some of his policies. One thing he did say is he was campaigning for the presidency, and he remained true to that as president. He promised never to lie to the American public. 18, it's kind of doubles back or relates a little bit back to 17. His lack of experience made it very difficult for him to work with Congress. So when you think about somebody, let's say like Barack Obama, who was president previously, he was a senator from Illinois. So when he got into the presidency, at the very least, he had worked with a lot of the people he needed to collaborate with in the Senate. So when you think about an outsider, they don't necessarily have those connections within Congress. 19, how did Americans react to President Carter granting amnesty? Amnesty is forgiveness for committing a crime. Many Americans were outraged that Carter would give a free pass to Vietnam War draft dodgers during the Vietnam War. Many Americans, instead of serving in the military, decided instead to move to Canada or another foreign country to avoid the draft. And they were supposed to be punished on return to the United States. So instead of punishing them, President Carter decided we wanted to just move on from Vietnam, and he decided to grant a full pardon or amnesty to those who had not served during the Vietnam War, had kind of dodged the draft. Those who were really upset would be those who had lost loved ones, who could not understand Carter's decision. Here they might have lost a father, a brother, a son, and now they're seeing Carter say, oh, it didn't matter. Their service didn't matter. Their sacrifice did not matter. There's also a question of future wars. If we ask for others to volunteer for the military in the future, or eventually do have another draft, and then they serve in the military and potentially lose their life, or at least put their life on the line, and then others who dodge the draft, are they going to get a pardon from a future president? It's hard to say. Okay, and then the last couple of things we'll look at here, just a couple economic policies. Inflation. Inflation, as I hope you know, and we kind of mentioned it already a little bit. The idea of inflation is the rise in the cost of goods. Now, when you look at the United States today, obviously we're struggling a little bit with the economy and the pandemic, high rates of unemployment. We also have a lot of extra dollars that are now circulating within the American economy. We've gone into additional debt, upwards of $25 trillion in debt now. So when you think about the value of the American dollar, the value of the American dollar is going down, then obviously the prices of goods, because the dollar is worth less, they may need more dollars in order to sell you a particular good or service. So inflation is the rise in cost of goods. Because it impacts all goods, it severely harms the average American family. When you look at the United States too, one of the ways you can measure how well we're doing is based on our trade. You have three different ways trade can go. You have what is called a trade surplus, which is a net positive. That means that you're manufacturing and selling more than you import. A trade deficit means that you're actually purchasing goods from China and other foreign countries more than you export. That's a trade deficit. And a balanced trade, it's not that you necessarily have things that are exactly equal, but roughly equal. Let's say you have 900 billion that you are exporting and you have 880 billion that you're importing. Well, I mean, there's a difference there of $20 billion, which seems like a lot, but in reality, it's pretty much balanced. It's not like a huge deficit between what's going in and what's coming out. So that would make it pretty much balanced. Apply what you learned about trade and explain the state of the American economy under President Carter. Well, the United States had a trade deficit as it imported more than it exported. The late 1970s was kind of a turning point too in the automobile manufacturing business, as consumers began purchasing for the first time in the 1970s more cars from Japan than we were buying from American manufactured cars. Tomorrow, the next lesson we're going to go into is actually a closer study or closer look at the 1976 election, which you're going to kind of look at some of the campaign ads and the election itself. And the day after that, we'll get back into part 2 of 18.6, which will be a closer look at the Carter administration. Until next time, Mr. Clark is out.